Okay, so let me just admit that I don't know if I can call this one of the topics that I don't like discussing as much, or if it's just the trickiness of it, but I'm not really the biggest fan of talking about money. I'm not the biggest fan of talking about it because there's a lot of, divided opinions on it. Some people don't seem to agree. Others feel like it's entirely dependent on the person that you're dating and whether you'll talk to them. But all in all, this episode is about money. And I know it's not the favorite topic of many. I know that some people just do not like discussing it. I think some people actually cringe almost the same way I do whenever I hear that someone's going to talk about money and relationships or money in relationships. But I feel like it's one of those things that we just have to discuss, because if it's this tricky to dive into and to discuss and come to some sort of agreement with as our people, I think we should discuss it a hell of a lot more so that more people can choose, at least some certain beliefs on it that would probably make a lot more sense, So instead of beating about the bush, let me just start things off from a non-relationship level and talk about Uganda. Now, World Bank recently suspended the new loans that it was supposed to give to Uganda, and all of this was over the anti-LGBTQ law that it passed pretty recently. Now, I'm not gonna lie, when I saw this title, one of the first few questions that was just popping up in my head, which I'd have probably asked the World Bank, is, why are you gay? LGBTI. Lesbians, gays, transsexuals, bisexuals, and intersexuals. There is no H. H for heterosexuals. Hey, if that isn't the most famous TV interview of all time, I don't know which one is. Like, that shit is funny. And I don't think there's that many people who watched the entire thing. But these guys went in. But anyways, let me just read the caption that came with this entire anti-LGBTQ story. So it says, and I quote, "The World Bank says it is halting new loans to Uganda because of a new anti-gay law which contradicts its core values. Homosexual acts were already illegal in Uganda, but anyone now convicted faces life imprisonment under the new law which was enacted in May." End quote. Okay, so let's just get this straight. I don't think there's that many executives. Actually, I don't think there's any executives of the World Bank that are openly gay. Okay, so finding that they are deciding to fight this law by not giving Uganda loans seems a little bit sus to me. Now, by all means, I'm not saying that, you have to be shagging another dude and you're a dude for you to fight for gay rights and shit or anything of that sort. It's just that it seems a little bit interesting that these guys are so hell-bent on having Uganda go back on its law, yet there's other countries with other laws which are pretty similar to this, which they're not doing shit to. Then on top of that, they can condemn it all they want, but it's not like they're going to do anything for these guys besides tell Uganda to reverse its policies against them, which I think is a little bit weird. Now, in my view of the entire thing, considering that the World Bank is made up of people from different countries that are very accepting to people of the LGBTQIAP+, and I'm hoping that's all the abbreviations that are required in there, and considering that Uganda doesn't really want the LGBTQ, well, how about they just do a trade? And I know this sounds like slave trade, but it's not. Just let me cook for a little bit with this one. Now, instead of the World Bank not giving them the loan, or even giving them the loan, they would just make it a trade. A World Bank affiliated country that is very in support of the LGBT can, take those people as like human capital and shit, put them to the workforce, and they can give up the money. And at the end of the day, there's a gain on both ends because you've gotten value in the name of human capital and like human resources and shit that you can put to work and make your money back. And the Ugandans who aren't very accepting of the LGBT can get the money, and they'll even be trading up more of these guys so that they can get even more money. So at the end of the day, it's like both sides will actually win, because the World Bank countries that are very pro-LGBT will have kept them safe, and the Africans will have gotten their money, and a lot less LGBT people. So when you kind of think about it, it just seems to work perfectly well. The only thing is, I don't think any of those countries nor the World Bank are willing to take these guys. And I think Uganda can actually get these loans from the Middle East, who are more giving and they don't give too much of a damn about that shit. Either way, I will leave it at that because I do have a podcast that I should have started minutes ago in a much better way with a lot less pettiness, where I start in a manner of saying, welcome to Breakdown on West Side, your number one breakdown podcast, coming to you from Nairobi, Kenya. The man on the mic is a man who should take up diplomacy or international trade. Either way, he seems to be pretty good at both. He's a man who likes his women the same exact way he likes his yogurt. It is none other than your tall, dark, and mildly handsome man, Sir Denver B. The show used to be called Tweet Street, but Twitter changed its name to X, and there's thread that's come up, and I don't know if I should take up one or the other, or use both, or if Threads is really viable. I don't know. Either way, it's usually just a simple show where you guys get to give me a lot of what I get to talk about. So normally it's a pretty simple drill, and you can be a contributor to the making of these episodes. Pretty simple drill, almost sounds like a song, and it goes like this. You see that tweet, you like that tweet, you want us to discuss that tweet, you send that tweet. You send it to the DMs of @BagakaTheD, which happens to be my personal X handle, and I will take it from there and handle it accordingly. On Facebook or on IG, if it happens to be a screenshot, if it happens to be a screen grab, if it happens to be on a reel, and you want it to be discussed and it was from Twitter, then the place to send it to is @Breakdown on West Side, and I will take it from there and I will handle it accordingly. Now, first things first, if you can hear a bunch of noise in the background and it sounds a little bit annoying, apologies for that. There's quite a bit of construction happening around my area, and if you think my voice sounds a little bit different, it's probably because I have some sort of a cold. But hopefully by the time you are listening to this episode, I will be well. Doesn't seem like anything too big, but such is life. We all get sick, but these episodes need to be produced. Anyways, now I have a couple of tweet cases, or just cases that I need to bring up and discuss. But before I get into any of them, there was actually one that sort of piqued my interest, which I felt just needed to be discussed. And it's based off of an open question, which I feel a lot of people usually wait until it's too late to sort of try and figure out. And the question itself reads, a married man earns 90,000 shillings. His wife earns 150,000 shillings. Who is supposed to pay the house rent? Now, when this question was asked, or should I say was posted up on Twitter and people were busy responding to it, it kind of really split people quite a bit, because some people were saying that the woman should pay the rent because she makes more money. Others were saying that it's the man's role as a provider to sort out the rent, so he should be paying it either way, regardless of whether the woman makes a lot or a little. Some other people were trying to find an in-between somewhere there, and they were saying that the woman should just contribute a little bit more, some shit. But to be very honest, this is one of those questions that when I read and I think about, I don't think there's a universally right answer. I think essentially when you look at most questions in regards to money in relationships, I don't think there's a universally right answer for a lot of them. But considering that these are actual situations that do happen to people, I do think that at least most people should discuss or have an idea on how to sort them out. And first of all, the first thing that I'd probably ask in all of this is, who the fuck told you how much the woman is earning? First of all, let's be particularly honest. People do not talk about how much they earn nowadays. It's not a very common thing. People hardly ever talk about that, even when they're married. And a lot of times people will be very deceptive. You might find that the woman is saying that she earns 150 grand and maybe she's making 450. And that's a reality that a lot of women actually have. They're making really good money, but because they fear competition from the man, or they fear that they're going to be treated differently by the man, or maybe they want to save up the money themselves or set up some sort of investment, they will hide how much they earn. Okay? And whether it's good or bad is still something that a lot of people can debate about. And I think I will be dealing with a case similar to this later on. But for the most part, to be very honest, when I saw this question, the first thing that clicked in my mind is, if you guys are in a happy, healthy relationship, this question shouldn't really be a problem for you guys. But for me to kind of give a better explanation, let me just say it like this, because there's a bunch of babes that expect the guy should pay for everything, who think that it shouldn't be a problem, but it probably is. But for the most part, I think if you are in a situation where your wife is earning more than you, then she can contribute a little bit more. I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to how you guys choose to talk it through. Personally speaking, I feel like if you guys have a joint account for all of your bills, not just the rent, then you guys can contribute either equally, or the person with more can contribute a little bit more, or if you're the man, you can contribute a little bit more. It depends. As long as the both of you can contribute so that you can sort out the bills together, then it shouldn't be that big of an issue. Otherwise, if one person is saying that it should be one person to sort out the entire thing versus another, then to be very honest, it's just going to continue splitting people, because there's some people that believe that it's a man's role to pay for everything and they think they're right. And there's people who are like, let's be realistic and sensible, that's not always the case, and they're not wrong either. And there's even people who are like, let's split the bills 50-50, and they're also not wrong as well. At the end of the day, it's one of those questions that becomes very individual in terms of what you think of as right or not right. But for the most part, as long as you guys can agree, you can actually sort most of this money shit out. And I'll even admit, my whole analogy of contributing towards a joint account and shit isn't a particularly new angle. I just think it's one that's not really given as much. I actually even pulled it off of a tweet from someone who was talking about how a lot of people on Twitter will usually like talk about, who should contribute what, and it's mostly unreal, because in reality you find that the married couples will actually set up like a joint account if they're financially, responsible, and they'll just contribute for the bills in there, and then whatever's left, they can decide how to deal with that shit later. And for the sake of this episode, I do think it's a particularly great take for most couples today, and considering that there's no real consensus, at least we've started off from a nicely tricky point, so I can get on with the cases for this episode. So on to our very first case of this episode. Now, it was actually a tweet that was made by a babe, which was being quoted and replied to, and the tweet itself says, and I quote, "If he says you only want money, run. He doesn't have any. Men with money don't care. I promise you they don't." End quote. Now, the person who was replying to this says, and I quote, "My favorite thing about these tweets is how nobody's in a relationship with these men, but they all know them." End quote. Now, I'm gonna be very honest, when I actually read both, whatever the guy was actually saying by saying that, the women who claim to know these men who have a lot of money aren't with them, just seemed a little too true, that I also felt like I was targeted in this entire thing. Because I also say that I know guys with money. And I probably shouldn't be giving too much of an opinion on this, because I can only say, at least as of right now, that I know guys with money. I don't have all that money, and I also believe that, you should avoid women who only want money, and maybe I fall under a broke category for some people, and that's entirely okay. I don't have to tick everyone's boxes all the time, and I'm perfectly okay with that. But when you kind of think about it, and I'll say this with my knowledge of my friends who make quite a bit of money, as well as a little bit of guy logic here and there, like, if there's a group of people that are extremely picky with a person that they want to be their partner, it's guys who make a shit ton of money. Like, you can talk about how he doesn't care, but guess who the pickiest set of guys are when it comes to selecting a babe? It's usually the guys who make a lot of money. Like, think about it for a second. You can go and you can date a guy who doesn't make all that much. And, let's assume he's making like 50k gross. And, after bills and sorting out everything, at the end of the month, he has maybe just a little bit to, have a fun weekend or two. Like, when you end up marrying this guy and at some point you want to leave him, the divorce is probably going to be more expensive for the both of you than whatever gains you're going to get out of it. Even though you're getting exactly half from like the net or even the gross, you're not really getting all that much money. But when you're looking at a guy who's making like 800 grand net, has like 2, 3, 4 cars, has one house and a set of apartments, and he lives in that main house, and maybe a beach house and like a business here and there, like, this guy is going to be extremely picky when it comes to the person that he wants to spend the rest of his life with, or at least pledge the rest of his life to, because this guy has a hell of a lot more to lose. You assume just taking half of that, and that's someone who's set for life. They'll never have to work a day in their lives, and they will literally just be enjoying the fruits of the labor of someone else. So of course they're going to be extra picky. Now, with that said, because, the tweet wasn't talking about how picky the dudes are, like, a lot of the babes that I usually hear having a lot of these standards are usually single. And I'm not saying this in a bad way, it's just there's the standards that you want and there's how you're supposed to behave towards a person who can live up to some of those standards, which usually has a bit of a disconnect. Now, you find babes who are like, oh, I want a guy that makes this much money, that can take me for this and pay for that. And normally they don't care that much about the money and shit. And yeah, it's probably true. The guy doesn't really care that much about spending like a bit of 10, 20, 30 grand here and there. Like that might be okay for him. And it might even be a drop in the ocean for them. But for the kind of guy that you want, the kind of woman that he expects to have is most times very different from what you are as a person. Like, yes, you can have some of these demands, but maybe he wants someone that is a little bit more humble, a little bit more feminine, doesn't make as much noise, isn't fussy about where you live or what car you should be driving, or even how you as the girlfriend should be dressing to go to X and Y places because now they're dating you. Like, they might be looking for someone who's a lot more down to earth, someone who's a lot more caring, who doesn't prioritize the money all that much, because at the end of the day, if it's about the money, then we don't know if you are going to be an amazing wife because the guy has a lot of money, or you will be planning to skim him of that money once you're married and you're just about to try and play an act the entire time. Either way, I believe that a lot of the guys who say that they don't care and they're willing to spend the money on a babe are a lot of times willing to spend the money because they're just going to smash and they're not trying to retain the babe. And the problem is, a lot of these babes who claim to have a lot of these standards end up smashing a lot of these guys and rely on their pussy and their riding skills to, hopefully retain the dude, which in a lot of cases rarely ever happens. But either way, I might be wrong about this shit, but I do have another case to discuss, so on to our very next case of this episode. Now, it's a tweet and it says, and I quote, "If a man must have a good paying job, a house and a car before marriage, surely being a virgin should be a bare minimum for you as a woman. Learn or perish." End quote. Now, in this particular day and age, I feel like having such standards, regardless of what side of the gender scale you stand on, is not only unrealistic, but it's mostly just dumb. At least in my opinion. Because on one end, you kind of have to think about this practically. How many babes do you think are virgins? And I know you're supposed to go for the best of the best because you put in all that work, blah, blah, blah. But how many babes who are really good people at heart are virgins? It's actually a very, very tiny number. And in a lot of places, you find that people lost their virginities at particularly young ages. And on top of that, for a lot of people, like I'll tell you, for example, here in Nairobi, for a lot of people, they're not going to get into a relationship before they've banged the babe. It's not one of those rules that's said, it's one of those rules that people just know off the top of their heads. So expecting that, and then you bang a virgin, you feel like, she's a virgin, but she's not all that, or she's not that great, or she's fussy and she's clingy, blah, 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 and you drop her. Now the next person that wants a virgin now can't get her because you decided to go and shag and move on, okay? So I think that's particularly unrealistic, at least from the guy's side. From the babe side, it's also unrealistic in that when you look at even our parents' times, which you could say economically were a lot better to actually acquire some of these things, it was still nearly impossible for those guys to get these sort of things. Like, and that's including the house part, because I'm assuming that this guy means owning a house, not renting a house. All right. Like, yes, you can have a good paying job. Yes, you can manage to get a car, but getting a house is harder for most people than you might actually think. Then now you bring it to now's time, where interest rates, at least in Kenya, are, absolutely unreasonable for most, and quite hard for most people to even get a loan, let alone getting a mortgage. Then you add, a good paying job and a car and the ability to keep all of those things running. And you find that for most people to actually get most of these things in check, they'd probably have to be like 40 before they can actually achieve most of these things. And that's for a larger number that might actually have the ability to stack up the cash, make more money, and be able to afford a number of these things in sequence, not all at once. So you honestly think that you can go and get yourself a guy who can have all of these things And assuming that there are some young guys that have it, because you are competing with other women, expect him to be completely faithful to you and want to be with no one but you, with all of your standards and all of your desires and a lack of humility. I don't know. I don't know. Even him getting into a relationship with some of y'all would be hard. Like, by the time a guy is achieving all of that, there's a certain kind of babe that he wants, and for a lot of babes right now, that's not the kind that he wants. But hey, then again, like I said earlier, maybe because I don't have that money right now, my opinions on whatever it is that those guys would want from babes might be a little bit skewed. But I will just leave it at that, leave you to interpret and tell me what your thoughts are on it, and move it on to our very final case. So on to our very last case of this episode, and it is a tweet, and I will read it for you because it says, and I quote, "We currently rent. Wife recently inherited money. She wants to buy a house outright, but she won't let me help. So it's all in her name, quote unquote, in case I leave. We have 3 kids. I'd never considered leaving until now." End quote. Okay, so when I kind of read this tweet, on one end I can see where the guy is coming from, and on the other end I can understand where his wife is probably coming from, even though I don't necessarily know the both of them. And I'm saying this from like a lot of the stories I'll hear here and there, okay? And also, before I say anything much about this, let me just give the typical disclaimer. I'm not a married man. I've never been married before, so whatever it is that I'm telling you, I'm mostly pulling out of my ass, and I'm probably the least qualified person to say anything about this particular case. Okay? Now, with that said, I'm gonna start by saying that I actually understand where the wife is coming from. At least based off of a bunch of the stories that I've heard about women and about abusive men in marriages. Like, I can get where she's coming from. There's a lot of women who, once they get out of a marriage because the husband is tired of them, they're left with nothing. A lot of women, and this is without including stuff like divorce, because trust me, there's not that many people that actually go out and get a divorce. There's also quite a number of women who have suffered abuse because they have, put a lot of things in the family name or in an account where the man can access it, and they end up seeing quite a bit of character development. And so I can understand if she'd want to have something of her own to keep in case her and her man's end up, not agreeing on shit and they eventually choose to split. Like, I can understand where that comes from. There's a sense of security to it. There's a sense of personal ownership and stability that you can fall back on in case things get tough. And I totally get where the woman is coming from. But I also get where the guy is coming from. You have 3 kids together. You've been married for however long. I'm assuming it's probably a little more than 5 years. And that's just by assumption based on the fact that there's 3 kids. So I'm thinking that based off of the time you guys dated, based off of the amount of time you guys have spent married, plus the fact that you have kids, as a guy, I'd be thinking that at least my wife would know that in the event of an issue between the both of us, I'm more willing to sort it out than to separate or divorce. That I probably won't go around trying to look for some young girl to sort of bang and get pregnant, or to have as a second wife, or to leave her for another woman. I think that's what quite a number of guys who have planted their roots and believe in the family and staying together with a wife would probably think and feel. And that makes a lot of sense. So when the baby's like, oh, I want to have everything in my name and I don't want you to pay a cent of it, it does seem like it's like you're preparing for the worst, which shouldn't even be there. Because I thought what we got into was supposed to be till death do us part. And I get that. But considering that a lot of women today have grown up watching their mothers lose everything and start with nothing, or they have watched their fathers squander the money that they have, I can see where the fear and the desire to have some sort of personal security that isn't tied to your marriage kind of makes sense. So to kind of make things a little bit better between the both of you, if you're uncomfortable staying in a house that your wife owns on her own, or if you're uncomfortable with the entire thing, then at the end of the day, you guys can still talk this out and kind of come to some sort of an agreement. So, for example, you guys can choose to agree that you guys don't actually live in that house. You can choose to own the house, but the wife can own it as an investment, not to have it as a home. So, you can have someone rent it and it can give her income and shit, and it can help with the paying off of the mortgage. But even for you as a guy, you also need to go and work and set up your own investments, because she's decided she's going to take that money and create something for herself. Then you should also be allowed to do something for yourself as well. Because at the end of the day, it's not like you can control what she gets to do with her money. But if having some sort of personalized security is something that she feels she needs because she doesn't know if the marriage will last long, then maybe you should also get your chance to create your own investment to do that. Of course, at the end of the day, it does kind of rob the entire family of disposable income, but if one person wants to secure themselves, then I feel like the other person should, because much as the wife might feel like it's an in case he leaves me, maybe he doesn't have anything for in case she leaves him. So, maybe he should also start setting up something of the sort. At the end of the day, I don't think that they should leave each other. I do believe that maybe they are happy and they still do want to stay together, but some of these fears that are there today may only be solved if the other side feels like they're getting an equal measure of the same thing. Although, then again, I might be wrong about all of this, so I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open on Twitter or X. It is at Bagaka the D. On Facebook and on IG, it is at Breaktime on Westside. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.